Alright, we're just going to get right into this. In this video, I'm going to be going over several NFL coincidences throughout the history of the league that I guarantee you will shock you. So, Super Bowl 48 was between the Denver Broncos and the Seattle Seahawks. But this game wasn't just your average Super Bowl, because both teams had a lot on the line going into this game. For the Broncos, they didn't know how much time Peyton Manning truly had left being an elite quarterback. And for the Seahawks, 8 years prior, they had just come off of a Super Bowl loss to the Steelers, and now had a chance to avenge their loss and get redemption. So it was safe to say that both teams had a lot on the line. But even with that being said, the Broncos did have 2 Super Bowls to their franchises named at this point, and the Seahawks had 0. None. And even with that being said, I'm not lying when I say that this game meant absolutely everything for the unbelievably loyal Seattle Seahawks fan base, and that would still be an understatement in and of itself. And to give you a little bit of background about Seahawks fans, they aren't your normal NFL fan base. They have held countless records for the loudest fan base in sports itself, and these Seattle fans have had such a big impact on games as fans that they've been able to get their own official nickname, which is the 12th man, or 12 for short. Remember that number as I tell you this statistic. Now, as Super Bowl 48 began, it's important to realize that in NFL football games, and especially the Super Bowl where the 2 best teams in the league play against each other, it is extremely unlikely for things to go super wrong very early on into a football game, which is exactly what happened on this first possession for the Broncos, as the Seahawks scored 12 seconds into the game exactly. Interesting, but I'm sure it's just a fluke. Then we reach the second half of the game, where the Seahawks have amassed a massive lead against the Broncos and have almost made it impossible for the Broncos to come back in. And just to make sure that the Broncos have no chance of winning this game, the Seahawks whip out their black magic and score exactly 12 seconds into the second half too. Huh? To me, that's a little weird that the team that prides themselves on their own fan base scored exactly 12 seconds in the name of their fan base on both halves of the most important game in their franchise's history. I guess you could make the case that the Seahawks got really fortunate, but you can't say the same thing about this next coincidence. In the 2001 NFL season, the Chicago Bears went into a Week 7 game against the 49ers at 5-1. And for most of this game, it was going very poorly for the Bears, as at one point they were down a massive 28-9 deficit. But they managed to come back and tie the game at 31, forcing overtime on a last-second play. Now, on the first play of overtime, the 49ers throw a pass to Terrell Owens, who gets absolutely pancaked by Brian Urlacher, and Bears safety Mike Brown intercepts the tipped ball for a walk-off interception, giving the Bears the win. Okay, nothing crazy there, right? Just a kind of cool interception to win the game, right? The very next week, the Chicago Bears, coming off that overtime win against the Niners, are playing the Cleveland Browns, and once again we're down a significant deficit, this time down 21-7 with a mere 45 seconds left in the game. Through some forms of absolute football miracles, the Bears were able to tie up the game on the last play of the game again, and once again sent the game into overtime. And in that overtime, Browns quarterback Tim Couch throws a pass which gets tipped into the air and falls straight into the palms of Mike Brown, who intercepts the ball and returns it for another game-winning pick 6. And I know you may be thinking that this situation is actually replicable, but never before, never in NFL history has a player with the same exact name intercepted a walk-off touchdown in consecutive overtime wins. And people have tried to calculate how improbable this situation could have possibly been. And after factoring in the chances of the same player getting an interception to win the game in back-to-back weeks, it had gotten to numbers like 0.000045%, and that's not even taking in other external factors. So the chances of this happening were virtually 0. So this is definitely the most insane NFL coincidence I've ever read in my entire life. And I don't know how I didn't know this existed before. So going into the 666th Monday Night Football game, the Jets would play against the Texans. The Jets starting quarterback going into this game was Mark Sanchez, and throughout his entire career, he had always worn the number 6. So going into this game, throughout the season, Mark Sanchez, who remember wore the number 6, had thrown 6 touchdowns on the year, threw 6 interceptions, had an average yards per attempt of 6.6, his longest completion was 66 yards, his average yards per pass attempt were 6.6, his longest completion on the season was 66 yards, and his quarterback rating was 66.6. But that's not all. because his backup quarterback on that night was Tim Tebow, the most vocal Christian in the entirety of NFL history. What? Anyway, I've already talked about Tim Tebow's relationships with NFL coincidences in the past, but this one was just crazy. So is Mark Sanchez the devil? Well, maybe to some people, but overall to me, this is just a kind of funny coincidence. So like I said with Tebow, I did look into a coincidence with him in the past, and I also looked into the Bobby Layne curse and the NFL coincidences that spurred off of that. But what I didn't know in that video is the striking similarities Bobby Layne had with Matthew Stafford, the former quarterback of the Detroit Lions. So if you don't know what the Bobby Layne curse is, I'll just give you a quick rundown. Basically, Bobby Layne played for the Lions in the 1950s and won 3 championships with them, until he was traded in 1958, and infuriated, he decided to curse the Lions as he was traded, saying the Lions will not win for 50 years. And exactly 50 years later, the Lions went 0-16, and in that following draft, they ended up selecting Matthew Stafford with the first overall pick. But if that was everything I had to tell you, it would not be in this video. Because these two potential Hall of Fame quarterbacks both grew up on the exact same street and went to the exact same high school, Highland Park in Texas. Matthew Stafford was also the starting quarterback of Highland Park for their first state championship since Bobby Layne had won it for them way back in the 1940s. And to wrap it all up, it had took Matthew Stafford the exact same amount of time to win a championship for Highland Park as it took Bobby Layne. Wow. So for this next one, I actually figured it out while doing research for my watching an NFL game from every decade video, and it really surprised me. So Frank Reich, the current head coach of the Indianapolis Colts, was once a backup quarterback in the NFL, and before that, in college as well. So all the way back on November 10th of 1984, Frank Reich was the backup quarterback for the University of Maryland. And going into the game as the backup quarterback, Frank Reich was not expected to play, and at the end of the first half, things were going very poorly, as his team was losing 31-0 at halftime. And in the second half, with University of Maryland down 31-0, might I remind you, they said, screw it, let's throw Frank Reich into the game and just see what happens. And what happened after that can only be described as a football miracle, because Frank Reich, the backup quarterback, led a 6-touchdown comeback in the second half alone and completed the most insane comeback in college football history. Now flash forward 8 years later, and after making the NFL, Frank Reich was the backup quarterback on the Buffalo Bills. Now keep in mind that he now held one of the most impressive comebacks in college football history up to this point. Now going into a wildcard game between Frank Reich's Buffalo Bills and the Houston Oilers, things were not going well for the Bills. For starters, going into this game, Jim Kelly had already been injured and wasn't going to play. So backup quarterback Frank Reich was thrusted into the game, and things continued to go absolutely horribly for the Bills. At the start of the second half, they were already down 35-3, and the game looked all but over. But some people out there did not know who was playing quarterback for the Bills that day, because Frank Reich was somehow able to turn this game around for the Bills and was able to do the same thing he did at the University of Maryland, overcoming one of the biggest deficits in NFL history, and completed an against all odds comeback to win the game for the Bills. So was it a coincidence that Frank Reich, a backup quarterback for his entire football career, was able to lead 2 of the most impressive comebacks in the history of the game of football? Well, I guess that's for you to decide. But this next one seems like a coincidence, but maybe it's just divine intervention. So in the entirety of NFL lore, there has been 7 NFL players that were drafted with the last name of Woodson. And from those 7 players, 5 of them, 5 have been Pro Bowl defensive backs. Rod Woodson, Charles Woodson, Darren Woodson, Abe Woodson, and Marv Woodson were all Pro Bowlers as defensive backs. Now, granted, Abe Woodson made his Pro Bowl as a kick returner, but he did play a defensive back position at the exact same time, so it still counts. And the 2 Woodsons out of the 7 that did not make Pro Bowls, Freddie Woodson and Xavier Woodson, only played in the league for 2 to 3 years before fizzling out of the NFL entirely. So if you're a general manager and you see someone in the draft with the last name Woodson, there is about a 60% chance that that player will become a Pro Bowl defensive back. Or at least that's what the numbers say. But the Woodson last name is not the only sacred one in the NFL. In the 1990s, there were 2 NFL players in the league that had the last name DeGraffenreid. Yeah, you heard me right, DeGraffenreid. So in 1993, the Cincinnati Bengals selected wide receiver Alan DeGraffenreid in the 1993 draft. Now, fast forward 5 years later, and the Arizona Cardinals select offensive tackle Alan DeGraffenreid in the 1998 NFL Draft. Completely different people, having no relations to one another. They were each selected within the same decade, having the same exact name, Alan DeGraffenreid. But there's more situations just like this, because in that exact same decade, in 1994, the 49ers drafted defensive tackle Brian Young. And in the 1995 season, the 49ers decided to sign undrafted free agent Junior Bryant. Now, Brian Young ended up being a Hall of Famer, All-Pro, multiple-time Pro Bowler, and Junior Bryant didn't really amass to anything, but it's still crazy that there's been so many instances of players with almost the same exact name and having no relations to each other whatsoever. And the similarities between those two don't stop there, because they both ended up playing football at Notre Dame and were both born in the month of January. And for the record, Brian Young had a child and did not name him Junior Bryant. It's a sad day for all. But if you enjoyed this video, then like and comment, because it really helps the channel a lot. And if you like this video, I'm sure you'll like this one right here on 4 moments that changed NFL history forever. It's really good, trust me. Anyways, until next time.